everyone. This is the second video when we're talking about this book here, What I Believe by Francois Mauriac. And the book, as I said in the first video, is made up of a number of different themes. And Father Conroy and I have both read the book and thought we'd pull out some themes that we'd like to discuss. The first video looked at the light, the dark, and spiritual self-care. On this video, we're going to talk about a few other themes that struck us as quite important to think about. So, Father, was there any other themes that came to your mind that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, one theme that struck me was, and I think you mentioned this in the first session, and Mauriac said that, and he said it quite strongly. He said that what I believe is different to what I know, and he was quite happy with that. Whereas I think a lot of people think, or they reject faith, or they say, well, I can't prove it, I don't know it, so I'm not going to accept it. But did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, because it kind of is a classic trade-off, isn't it, in some ways, about knowledge and faith. I mean, this isn't new territory necessarily. This is a kind of lifelong theological debate about faith and reason. And I think one of the things to point out about the Catholic faith is that faith and reason aren't necessarily in conflict with each other at all. And in some ways, reason is important because it allows us to think quite carefully about our faith and to be healthily critical about our relationship with God in some ways and how we actually journey towards that. So that struck me as important. I also think that those that seek knowledge about and to prove things, to be definitive about things, I think that's also quite difficult territory, even if you remove faith from it. Because even in the empirical world, even if you want to understand facts, there's so much to be discovered. And how do you know everything? Do we have the human capacity to have full knowledge? Is that something we actually have? And, Thomas Aquinas talked about this idea of God's essence. I really like that term, essence, because it tells you something about the intangible in some ways. It surrounds you. It's spiritual in many ways. And so Thomas Aquinas talks about God's essence, and that no, God is not like a created form. In other words, we try and humanize God and to kind of think of God in human terms, which is actually quite a difficult way to start the conversation, because you're coming at it from the wrong end in some ways, because God is not you or me. And I think that's a fundamental problem, whereby we think we are God, therefore we think that we're important, and therefore we think we need to know all the knowledge, and we need to know everything, and that we're in charge. I think you talked about in the first video, Father, this idea of, trying to, in some ways, use power as a way to define who you are. And I think that can be the root of evil in some ways, and the kind of darker side of life. So I think these themes kind of merge into each other in some way, and that's why they call it a theme, because you can't neatly demarcate some of these debates, which is fine. But I think this idea of faith and reason is one of those classic debates, and there comes a point, I think, where you have to realise that having all of the answers to everything is not possible, and sometimes not particularly desirable either, because you might not want to know the answer. So I think that's all part of faith, isn't it? It's about having an awareness of the fact that, we're not all the centre of the universe.
Yeah, I think a lot of people find it difficult, though, to live with mystery. I think that it comes back to that in many ways, doesn't it? And it's almost as if people are saying, well, they live with mystery, they live with not knowing things, but then they don't accept that in many ways. They limit, I suppose, their existence then limit how they approach life to what they do know, what they feel they can know, and the rest of it they say, well, let's not bother about that. It's not within my ken. But other people then sort of say, well, let's focus in and say, this is what we can know, and if we don't know this now, mathematically or logically, science will be able to tell us this in the future. So they use those ideas to marginalize God, to push God to the side and say, well, we can't know about God, so we'll say nothing about him. What was it? Was it Wittgenstein, the philosopher, that says, what man doesn't know about, he shouldn't speak about? Mm. So we don't know God, so let's just forget him.
Yeah. So it's about the kind of empiricist perspective of you need facts to generate knowledge, and that's where it ends. But I think the interesting thing about that is, even for people that don't believe in God, the presence of mystery, I think, is there. Whether or not you feel God's got a hand in it or not is an interesting debate in itself. But even if you're, let's say you're an atheist and you have a child, and you look at your baby for the first time, and that profound feeling, what is that? Where does that come from? The love you have for your partner, the love you have for your friends, and the kind of tangibleness of love in many ways. I personally think, removing God from that is problematic, because there's so much more to us than simply how we react to the other. There's something more profound within all of that. So I think this thing about mystery, I think we all live with mystery, even if we sometimes don't think God's got a hand in it, or not particularly prepared to accept it. I think people are surrounded by mystery in their lives in terms of how they interact with each other.
Mm. But then, practically speaking, a lot of people say, well, it's not something I can know. It's of no use to me on the practical level.
Yeah.
So let's just leave it aside. Let's forget about it. Don't talk about it. Don't bring it up to me, because it's of no use to me in how I'm living my life.
Yeah.
In this modern culture in which we're living, I suppose there's, what is it, postmodernism almost.
And this is
postmodernism now.
Yeah, I mean, this is a theme that's actually in the book, and this idea of how ideas can shape how we think, and the dominance of political ideology and the forces of that. If we think about the politics of the physical rather than the metaphysical, obviously people like Karl Marx, was very much kind of anti-God in many ways. And we can see how in recent decades, the kind of rise of liberalism and the kind of individualism associated with a number of developments, but often around political ideas, around the kind of rolling back of the state, and the idea of how the individual is very important, but also the kind of postmodernist perspectives on, there's not really a structure to explain our lives. It's actually about the individual and individual preferences that are important. To gain true fulfillment in life, it's about fulfilling your own individual ambitions. It's about bringing the self into its importance. And in some ways, I mean, obviously within academic life, we see quite a lot of postmodernist perspectives. We see a lot of kind of anti-religious perspectives, in kind of my line of work, if you like. But I think more broadly, we've seen that in society, haven't we? Where the kind of liberalist movement is less about society as something that's an entity, but it's actually about the individual and the pursuit of individual goals. And in some ways, that's the economic model that we've been living with for quite some time. And particularly after the rise of Thatcherism and Reaganism in the US. We've seen this idea about kind of neoliberal market economics. You know, it's all about individual enterprise.
Yeah.
What about your fellow man? What about the social dimensions of what you're doing?
There was that famous quote of Margaret Thatcher, which is often misquoted, isn't it? She said, "Society doesn't exist, it's the individual."
Yeah. No such thing as society.
No such thing as society.
Yeah, just individuals and families.
Mm.
Now, of course, we've got individuals and we've got families, but there needs to be some kind of recognition of ordering. I mean, I know from myself, having young children, that it takes a community to raise a child. You know, it's not just the parents, it's not just friends.
Yeah. But the problem with community is it's made up of individuals, and we don't always get on.
And Father, on that topic of kind of individual conflict and the fact that we don't always get on, you know, I think one of the interesting themes from the book was this concept, or this idea around enemy brothers, and how it can be a distraction in some ways from what truly matters. But it is a challenging area, and it is a challenging area because in the book, you know, Francois talks about the conflict between individuals within the faith itself, and he talks about the church, and the kind of there can be sometimes different branches in the church with different sets of ideas, different perspectives, and you got the sense of frustration in the book about, you know, trying to navigate some of this and try to make sense of it can be quite difficult. But I think that in some ways the church is probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, you know, not too different from lots of institutions in a way, whereby you have individuals that have sometimes different points of view, and there can be conflict, and trying to reconcile those can be difficult. I mean, even if you think about the debates we're seeing in society just now, outside of the church, if you think about political parties, you know, you've got Keir Starmer down at Westminster trying to appease the factions of the Labour Party to try and introduce an opposition to the Conservatives. So Keir Starmer's got the kind of more communist wing of the Labour Party on the one side, and he's got the more traditional Labour mentality on the other, and trying to bring all these factions together. It requires leadership. I mean, that's a key thing, you know. It requires leadership, but I think it's also about trying to understand how there can be some functionality and reconciliation between different sections, if you like, of an organisation. And if you're thinking about it from a faith journey, you can understand those that might be new to the faith or considering becoming a Catholic. They might sometimes look at some of the issues in the church and say, where do I fit best? So am I a traditionalist, or am I a, you know, innovator, if you want to call it, for want of a better word? And or is it important to not overemphasize that stuff? Can that be, well, is that particularly healthy on a faith journey to focus too much on the enemy brother dimension? I guess that's what came to my mind. What about yourself?
I found it very interesting because I think since he wrote that, society has moved in a direction that it was already moving in, and that's in terms of individualism. And Mauriac, although he was in the church and the institution of the church, and remained true to that, and although he could look at these other people who, I suppose, they were political disagreements he was talking about, there was for him this common bond that you spoke of. You started off speaking about of belonging, this sense of belonging. But now in our culture in the West, where individualism has progressed to the extent that it's cutting off those links that used to cement individuals together. So, clubs, well, there's still football clubs that have fierce fanatics But there's not an awful lot else that does it. I mean, even nationalism, the countries are falling apart, they're dividing in terms, and individuals, I think, they're understanding themselves less in terms of where they came from and more in terms of how I feel. And I think that's being seen in all sorts of manifestations, I suppose, and of the way that people are expressing themselves nowadays, and what's becoming acceptable that perhaps 2 or 3 generations ago, were unacceptable because they weren't part of a tradition, and people were held within the tradition. But the way that individualism has developed, it's now given people a freedom to sort of say, well, this is who I am. And I'm this way because I feel I'm this way, not because I've come from this particular background or I look this way or whatever. So I think that perhaps goes some way to explain why there is among so many people a distrust of institutions. They don't see where they fit into it because they don't fit into anything. They're individuals. It's as if we've all become adolescents who are mixing with other people and finding out where they belong, and they just navigate to people who are like-minded. Whereas before, it wasn't that, it wasn't the individual that was the center point. It was a system or a belief or an institution that was the center point. So I think we're in a transition period, not just for the church, but for society, as you said, in general. And, I sometimes wonder what the future of democracy is as well with this. What is the future of the church? And that brings me back to this other thing, which I think Moriak said was, well, it's the church was important to him because it was the link back to the person of Christ. And he saw without that institution, it was just something that he could make up or anybody could make up.
Yeah.
So that personal aspect of it, I think, is something, I suppose, to come back to the religious, or your spiritual well-being, that there is this need for this spiritual, personal relationship with Christ.
Yeah. And, you kind of mentioned this idea of institutions, and I think that's true. I think if you think about something like the Brexit vote, you've got a lot of people coming out to vote to say, we want to disrupt the current political order. And sometimes that can be based on an informed opinion about European politics, the UK's history, with regards to its relationship with the European Union. But for some people, it's not about that. For some people, it's about rebelling against a status quo that doesn't seem to work for them, or they don't feel that they can engage in the political process.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I often heard, in terms of, my line of work in the institution at the university, is that the day after the Brexit vote, the most common search term in the Google search engine was, what is the EU? Right? So there's lots of people that aren't necessarily informed about what's going on, but they might have reasonable cause for feeling that they don't fit in. And I think that goes back to the earlier theme around the kind of disordered nature of life at times, and how sometimes, our health, or sometimes our mental health, can be damaged if we don't have some kind of faith structure. And, it goes back to that point that Moriak made there about, having the institution of the church was a way for him to order his life in some ways. Now, I don't know if I can make that a neat connection between Brexit and Moriak, but there's something there.
There is, yes. I think you're right. And I think, in our modern society too, where in this feeling of people, they're looking for something to attach themselves to.
I mean, these are important issues. I mean, we have covered quite a lot of ground. And I think, to be honest, when I was reading the book, I could have picked out several more themes as well. But perhaps we can revisit them at another time. But I think, I would encourage people to take the time to read the book themselves, because I think we all take different things from the book, and we kind of, that's a great thing about these types of readings. We can almost think about how our own experience aligns with that of the author. So I've very much enjoyed speaking with you, Father,
Yeah,
about
it's been
this.
very interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, and I hope everyone enjoys the video. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.